Okay, we are recording. I am joined today by Michel Xhignesse from Capilano University. So thanks so much for joining me, Michel.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. And maybe I should just start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you guys from Nuchlelechum, which is an island on the ancestral and entirely unceded lands of the Squamish people.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about your paper, Imagining Fictional Contradictions, which came out in Synthes in last year, 2020. Good year, good year. So in the paper, you argue that we can't imagine fictional contradictions, right? Contradictions are impossible things in fiction, in any real sort of thick, robust sense, and that contradictions and other impossible things can't be true in fictional works. And so I want to start by just asking you to talk a bit about why people would reject that idea, right? That why people think that, well, contradictions and impossible things can be true of fictions, and indeed we can imagine them, which is, really the dominant view. And so why do people think that, and then why are they wrong?
Yeah, I mean, you're really right. Like, not only is it the dominant view, but like, I'm pretty sure everybody else thinks that, apart from me. Certainly, that's the pushback I've gotten from people for a while now. Whenever I present these ideas, I think it mostly just comes from this intuition we have that like we can tell whatever stories we want to tell. So like if I want to tell a story in which the circle is squared, all I have to do is tell a story in which the circle is squared. Like once upon a time there was a square circle, the end. It's not a good story, but if I was a good writer, I could like fill in more details and make that seem a lot more plausible. I think it's really driven by that intuition, just that we can write whatever stories we want to write. Certainly in philosophy, like when we're talking about the dominant approaches to philosophy of literature, they're they tend to be approaches that are really committed to this idea, like as a fundamental fact. They're committed to the idea that the possibility of having contradictions in a story, that the possibility of impossible stories is like supposed to be a fundamental feature of fiction, right? It's supposed to be something we have to be able to explain. So when you take like a Waltonian model, like a pretense theory of fiction, the idea there is just that authors use texts as props to prescribe imaginings to the audience, right? And one of the things they can prescribe that you imagine is that the circle is square or that a box is empty and contains a figurine, those kinds of things. Alternately, in the fictive utterance model, which is probably the biggest sort of counterpoint to the Waltonian model these days, authors of fiction are supposed to like create their stories, tell us their stories with the fictive intent that we make believe the story's content. And again, the idea is, well, I can have the fictive intent that you make believe that this circle is square, that this box is empty, contains a figurine, that this knight exists but doesn't exist, those kinds of things. So I think it all just kind of boils down to that basic intuition that you can write any old story you want to. Nobody can stop you from writing it, right? The limit is maybe your imagination and your skill, but that's not any kind of real limit.
Okay, yeah. So there could be a story where, there's a world where our laws of mathematics turn out to be false, that there can be such things as squircles, right? Or, there are worlds, fictional worlds where it's true that the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold. So a box can be empty and contain a figurine at the same time in that world. Right. And a thought that just occurred to me was, imagine, since this is the topic of your paper, imagine that we're living, several hundred years ago before non-Euclidean geometries came into being. Right. And so, for us, back in pre-non-Euclidean times, right, the idea that two parallel lines could ever meet in space would just be unimaginable to us, right? In a certain extent, at least mathematically, that's clearly false, right? That's clearly a contradiction. It just sort of violates the analytic definition of what it is to be parallel. And so I don't know where I'm going with this. Help me take this idea somewhere, right? So it just seems impossible, and yet the laws of mathematics change, right? So maybe what these people think, or a line of defense they can make is that well, the law of non-contradiction is true to us, but maybe in the future it turns out that our laws of logic were just wrong, right? Or that our laws of mathematics were wrong and there can be square circles. So is it something along those lines that could help defend them, or that's sort of part of their thinking?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, a lot of the people, well, a lot of the people, some of the, sort of big names who like subscribe to this idea that you can have contradictory stories are people like Graham Priest, right? And of course, he's famous for pushing paraconsistent logic, and he thinks paraconsistent logic is the logic of fiction, right? And the reason he thinks it's the logic of fiction is because he thinks, we should start out by trying to explain this fact that stories can be contradictory. And if that's right, if paraconsistent logic is the logic of the world, or is somehow the logic of a fictional world, then yeah, like it kind of seems like you have to be able to allow for contradictions in those stories. Although, you wouldn't want explosion to be, a proper like inference rule in those stories. You wouldn't want it to be a consequence of those stories that you can have explosive inferences. That would be a problem for any paraconsistent logician.
So explosive inferences then would be something like what?
It's just the idea you can conclude anything, you can infer anything validly from a contradiction, right? So if I've got P and not P, if I say something like, I don't know, my pants are pink, my pants are not pink, therefore I like ice cream, right? That's a valid inference because it's not possible to make, the premise set all true, right? Because they're a contradictory pair. So explosion the principle of explosion just hinges on that. On that fact that you can prove anything from a contradiction.
Yeah, exactly. So it would mean that everything is true.
Yeah, that's right. Everything, and at the same time, it's opposite. Right?
Yeah. Everything and its opposite is true in these fictional worlds, and so they just become like incoherent in a sense, just like beyond human comprehension or understanding, or something of that sort.
Yeah, right. I'm glad you brought up the geometry example earlier, though, because I think. So there are some really cool like instances like in like history, right? In the history of literature that involve trying to introduce people to non-Euclidean geometries. So as you said, right, like obviously parallel lines, they never meet. Turns out if you do some non-Euclidean geometry, you find out they meet at the point of infinity, which is really far away, right? But that's not intuitively obvious, right? You have to do a fair bit of pretty complicated math to get there. There's a guy, you're probably familiar with him, Edwin Abbott, who in the late 19th century wrote a book called Flatland, A Romance in Many Dimensions. It's a really cool little book. It's like 100 pages long or so, maybe 120. And it had like two basic goals. One was to sort of satirize Victorian attitudes, particularly towards women, but in general, like Victorian social attitudes. But the other, the main aim was to introduce people of the time to non-Euclidean geometries and to thinking in these, I guess, like different ways, right? So it's a story about a square who sort of is introduced to three dimensions, right? He lives in a two-dimensional plane and he's introduced to the concept of three dimensions, and he sort of, explores around and finds out some pretty cool things. Then he finds out there are higher like levels as well. So there's a fourth dimension and possibly other dimensions. It's a really cool story, but like, it would really have stretched the imaginations of its audience at that point, right? Because those kinds of insights were limited to like, like a couple people in Germany, basically. Right? So I think it's right to have this intuition that like, just because we don't necessarily know how to imagine it, that doesn't mean that it's false. Right. And we could be wrong about the things we think we know. And it's easy to imagine being wrong about the things we think we know because it happens all the time. Like I think, what have I been wrong about? I don't know. I'm blanking. I've been wrong about lots of stuff recently. I just can't remember it. But it happens all the time. It's not a stretch to imagine that happening.
Yeah. Okay. So cool. So why then are these people wrong, right? Why is the dominant view that you are singularly up against, right? Why is the view that we can imagine contradictions, and that contradictions and other impossible things can be true of fiction? Why is that view wrong in your view?
Yeah, so there's like two levels to this. So on the one hand, I don't think you can have properly contradictory stories anyway, like in the first place. And if that's right, then that's nice and easy. It's nice and tidy. I don't spend a lot of time arguing for that in this paper. I have another paper called Exploding Stories and the Limits of Fiction, which is about that. But that's sort of, I'm just mentioning that as part of the background, right? So there's, on the one hand, I don't think you can have um, violations of the law of non-contradiction. I think it's because of the way in which our storytelling practices are structured. I think they're structured in such a way that we take it as a background principle with us into the story, that the law of non-contradiction applies, so that when we see a contradiction, it's kind of jarring. We try to resolve it, right? When you're paying attention to like the Harry Potter stories, and you find out that Merlin went to Hogwarts, you're like, cool, right? That sounds good. But then your brain kicks in for a second, and you're like, hang on a minute. Merlin was a 5th century wizard. Hogwarts was, founded in like the 10th century or the 11th century. So like, in what sense did Merlin attend Hogwarts? That doesn't make sense. That's a problem, right? So on the one hand, right, I think that on the one hand, I think our storytelling practices are arranged in such a way that we don't believe contradictions at face value. It's not enough just to see the contradiction. An author can tell us something. They can tell us anything they want. But in order to make it true, they have to do more work. We can't just assume that things are true. And our default assumption when we enter into a story is that if there's conflicting evidence, one of those pieces of evidence is wrong. So that's like the sort of bottom level, more fundamental fact, I think. The other level is just that I think that when we explore what people mean, when they say we can imagine contradictions, and in particular in stories, it turns out that the things they're describing are not actually instances of directly imagining contradictions. So they'll describe things like, I think this comes from Marcello Fiocco. They'll tell us, well, you can always like stipulate that some fact in the story satisfies the prescription to imagine. So like, you're reading a thing about squircles. The author wants you to imagine a squircle, and you can just sort of stipulate that whatever you've done in your head, that satisfies that prescription. I mean, okay, you can stipulate whatever you want, but that's not the same as actually doing it, right? Or Dominic Gregory will say, well, you can kind of combine a sensory imagining with supposition to get there. So like, if I ask you to imagine a megagon, that's a 1 million sided figure. Obviously, I can't do that. You can't do that. No human being can. But what we can do is imagine a dodecahedron, and we can sort of abstract away from what that regular polygon looks like to what a 1 million-sided polygon would look like. Like it's easy to describe. It would look basically like a circle, but if you looked really closely, or a circle, a sphere, but if you looked really closely, it would have like, little faces. We can do it that way, but again, that's not actually imagining a 1 million-sided figure. It's just sort of imagining something similar and stipulating that that's enough. Peter Kung has suggested that all you have to do is just like not realize that what you're being asked to do is impossible, and that's good enough, right? So like, if I'm reading along, right, if I'm reading the Harry Potter stories and I find out Merlin went to Hogwarts, I'm like, cool, awesome. And I don't know anything about, like Arthuriana, so I just take it for granted that that's the case. I mean, yeah, I'm imagining that Merlin went to Hogwarts, but I'm not imagining the contradiction, right? I'm not imagining the problem, which is that on the one hand, he went to Hogwarts. On the other hand, he couldn't have, right? Because there's a 500-year gap there. So the strategies seem to all kind of be like this, right? They're like, start out by imagining the box is empty. Now imagine the box contains a figurine, but it's never like put them together in a conjunction and actually imagine what it would be like to have the contradiction. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the main problem here, is that all these strategies sort of fail. They all involve sort of glossing over the contradiction rather than actually directly imagining it for ourselves.
Okay, yeah. So you're imagining something else, something that's adjacent to the impossible thing, or maybe not the impossible thing, but the very difficult thing. It's adjacent to it. It's similar to it. It's getting you in the right direction, but you're not really imagining the thing. You're imagining something else. Similarly, if I were to say, imagine this fictional mammal that's a lot like a rhinoceros, but has all of these different characteristics, right? Well, probably you just imagine a rhino, right? But it's genetically different. It looks exactly like a rhino. Well, is imagining a rhino sufficient to have imagined? Well, maybe. You get the look of it, and maybe that's all you need. And you don't need to imagine its genetic code or anything of that sort. I don't know. That's probably a terrible example for you.
No. That's a great example. So this is what Roy Sorensen has called meta conceiving or meta imagining, right? Where we do imagine something, but then we we do the glossing over, right? We take that to satisfy whatever the prescription was. So like, I'm reading the story about the mathematician who discovers that I don't know, Gödel's theorems are like false, right, rather than necessary truths. Okay, great. What I can do there, right, to imagine that is I can imagine like the headline in a newspaper, right? Mathematicians discover Gödel is wrong. What I'm doing there is I'm imagining the headline on the newspaper. I'm not imagining that like the incompleteness proofs are wrong somehow, right? I'm not going down to that level of detail, which is what I would need, I think, in order to directly imagine that those events took place. Or similarly, math is a good example because mathematicians are like weird creatures, right? Who knows what goes on in math departments? Something, right?
Yeah, we can imagine it, but we can only, get close to what's really going on.
Yeah, that's right. So like, I don't know what mathematicians do. I don't necessarily know, like I took the metalogic course like everybody else did, so I can sort of follow along while you do the incompleteness proofs. But like, who knows, right? Maybe a mathematician could possibly discover something. So what I'm doing, is just imagining that like there's some special mathematician out there who has some special insight, but I'm never imagining the lower level facts that make it true. And I think it's those lower level facts that make it true that we're actually interested in when we talk about contradictions being possible. In the same way, like in the real world, I can say whatever I want, right? I can say that, I don't know, it's snowing. And I can also say it's not snowing. And I can put those together in a sentence, right? It's snowing and it's not snowing. It's sort of snowing. There's a couple flakes. I can say that, but like making it true is like a whole other task. I call this the says is gap, right? So it's easy for authors to say things. It's a lot harder to make them true in the story. Different constraints come into play.
Excellent. So one important part of your account is the distinction between occurrent reading and reflective reading. So could you go a bit into that a bit?
Yeah, good. So you might think that there are like different ways in which you can sort of imagine something or process imagining something, right? There's the one level where you're just sort of like reading the text and just absorbing it as it comes. And you might say, okay, well, fine, I'm just doing whatever the imagining is. And it's just very, very minimal, right? It's very bare bones kind of reading and imagining. And then there's the kind of stuff I can do at home when I put the book down and like start thinking about it, right? That's much more involved. So you might think, well, maybe it's possible to get a contradiction on these minimal readings and not on the others. So the distinction between the like very pared down kind of reading and the much more like robust reading is what I'm calling the distinction between occurrent and reflective reading. So occurrent reading is just the reading we do for fun, right? It's what happens when you're reading a story and you're really absorbed in it and you just sort of motor along and you're just kind of absorbing the story. Reflective reading is the kind of reading you do for class, right? It's the reading you do where you're trying to figure, okay, well, like, what's the different like symbolism that's at work here, and like what kind of broader points or themes is the author working with? What are they actually trying to say? How does the text like hang together? What's the meter? All those kinds of questions are more reflective questions. They're questions that have to do much more with the propositional content of the story. Right there, it's the boring reading you do for class, right? It's what happens when we read philosophy papers, usually, unless they're really engaging.
Yeah, that we typically don't just sort of skim through a philosophy paper. Maybe our students do that. sometimes, but we professional philosophers don't do that. And so how do you employ that distinction to help you make the case that we can't imagine things that are contradictory in fiction, and that these things just can't be true of fictional works?
Yeah, so I think that like the epistemic standards we bring to bear with these different kinds of reading are different because our goals are different, right? When I'm just reading for pleasure, I'm not usually paying a whole lot of attention to like the minute details of the story. So like, hang on, I have a book here. Ha! It's called Time Machine 2. There's a bit of, there you go, Time Machine 2. The Search for Dinosaurs, right? And it's just a choose your own adventure story. It's probably the best in that series, by the way. It's a series from like the 80s and 90s. It's got like 50 or 60 books.
I remember reading
Good.
those. I probably read that one at some point too.
Yeah, it's probably the best of them. Anyway, the idea is the book is your time machine, and you're supposed to go and like photograph an Archaeopteryx, right? So you have to figure out what time period it lived in, and you're supposed to go do the stuff. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a choose your own adventure. So there's different like dead ends and things that you might get stuck in. There's also like a series of instructions at the beginning, right? So they tell you this book is your time machine. There's a few different rules. You can't like hurt anybody or anything. You also can't leave any equipment from the future back in the past. And okay, so what ends up happening in this story, right, is that as you're moving around from different time periods to others, you're constantly leaving equipment behind in the past, right? There's no way to avoid it. Now, I noticed that, right? Because I'm a little more detail oriented. I'm a philosopher, right? I know about logic and contradictions and things. I'm also not 8, right? And this is a book for 8-year-olds, right? So I'm noticing all those things as I'm going around. And it's kicking me into this more reflective mode of reading, right? I'm getting really worried about the fact that, you know, I've been going through time, leaving equipment behind. That seems like a really bad thing given the rules. But if I'm 8 and just reading this, in fact, I probably was 8 when I first read it. I don't notice, right? I don't care. I'm just kind of going along and I'm flipping through the pages and like, you know, trying to figure out how to find my Archaeopteryx, and it's just kind of fun. So I think what's happening here, right, is that when we're reading occurrently, we're not very concerned with things like consistency or contradictions. We're not very concerned with like causal relations either, or like, you know, how things happen in the story. We're just reading for the pleasure of reading the story. We just sort of take it at face value. When we encounter a contradiction, we don't like spend a lot of time on it. Most of the time, we don't even notice it, unless it's like really like self-evident or like a really central element of the story, right? If you're reading Graham Priest's story, Sylvan's Box, it's about a box that's empty and contains a figurine, so you'll probably notice it, right? It's also a short story, so it's just a few pages long. You'll probably notice the contradiction, but most of the time we don't, you know, when we're engaging with stories. When we're reading reflectively, you know, as philosophers or as like people thinking about the story, it's a different beast, right? We're paying a lot more attention to the details of the story. And when you do that, you do end up finding weird inconsistencies. A lot of the time they're accidental, right? Like Merlin in Merlin and Hogwarts. There's also, I think it's in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, like early on in the story, Monday, like September 1st is a Monday, and then at some point later on, September 1st is a Tuesday, right? They occur pages and pages apart. You probably don't remember coming across it, right? That's easy to deal with. We mostly don't notice those. The ones we notice are, you know, when we take the time to notice them, when we're going around being really, I don't know, really pedantic about the story. And I think when we're talking about what's true in fiction or what's true in stories, right, that's a philosopher's set of questions. It's not the kinds of questions you get normally just out there in everyday life. It's the kinds of questions you see in like the pages of a journal. And so the epistemic standards we bring to bear are really, really strict. And when those standards are really, really strict, the evidence you need to satisfy them is different than what you might otherwise need, right? So when I, as a philosopher, am told there's a contradiction here, that better be the case, right? It better be that I really am being told to imagine a contradiction. And if you tell me, if you hand wave it away, right, you say, well, yeah, you can imagine contradictions. All you have to do is not notice it's a contradiction. I'm gonna I'm gonna put on my pedantic hat and say, well, hang on a minute, right? Are you just asking me to imagine a thing and its opposite as like separate imaginings, or am I really actually putting them together in a conjunction? And it's not clear that that's the case.
Yeah, so I like the example of the choose your own adventure and how it violates its own rules. Like it establishes the rules at the beginning, then it violates its own rules. And if you're an 8-year-old, you're probably not going to notice that, unless you're an incredibly pedantic 8-year-old, which you and I may have been. I honestly don't think I was, but maybe I was. Right. But as an adult reading it and as a philosopher reading it, you're going to notice that it violates its own rules. And this happens, not only in literature, it happens in movies and films. And so an example that came to mind as you were talking was in the 2 Ant-Man movies, which perhaps you've seen. Okay, so in the 2 Ant-Man movies, a lot of people have seen these. It's sort of set up that how the shrinking works is essentially what happens is the distance between the nucleuses of the atoms that make up whoever's wearing the suit are shrunk. And so the distance between those, which are just empty space, right, are shrunk, and so that's how the shrinking happens. And so all of the mass is preserved.
Okay.
So if you're 180 pounds, normally when you're shrunk, you're still this 180-pound things, which can allow you to punch people and so forth, like super strong, right? I can't recall. This may be the second movie. Now, so that's set up in the first movie. Like these are the rules. This is how the shrinking works, as described by the scientist who invented it, right? In the second movie, that scientist has a keychain that's a tank. He then, uses the anti-shrink button or whatever and blows it up. It's a real tank that he shrunk down. Now that tank shrunk down, given the rules of the first film, he should not be able to use that as a keychain, right? If all of its mass is preserved, right, that's a 4-ton, 5-ton, whatever vehicle there, right? That ain't a keychain. That's a problem. So, if you're not paying attention, it's not going to bother you, right? It doesn't really hurt the movie. Maybe he's BSing in the first movie, maybe but it seems like the rules have been rewritten, right, to accommodate this cool visual of this cool moment, right? And again, most viewers aren't going to pay attention to that, but if you are a viewer that notices it, you could be watching the film Occurrently and then just sort of immersed in it, and then this moment happens and you're sort of pulled out of it, right, immediately reflecting like, how the hell is this possible given the rules that were set up previously, right? And films do this all the time, right? And especially like time travel movies, right, and time travel stories, they set up rules that then somehow get violated, right? There are a lot of very bad time travel fiction, precisely because of that. The rules just don't work. It's inconsistent with itself. So I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah. So this happens too. Like sometimes it's a contradiction that kicks you off into like the reflective mode, but sometimes it's not, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with the film critic Mark Kermode, but he's a British film critic. And one of the things that he likes to say, right, is when he's watching like a children's animated feature, for example, if he finds himself reflecting too much on like how good the animation is, right, like how realistic the water's been rendered, or like, oh, how did they get all that like hair detail on like the Sasquatch's arms and things, that's a sign that the movie is not working, right? It's a sign that the movie is not captivating enough, that the story is not engaging, right? Because he's been kicked out into this mode where he's spending a lot of time talking about the art direction or thinking about the art direction rather than being immersed in the story. So there's lots of different like things that can kick us out of this occurrent mode of engaging with a thing. Now that's not to say that like occurrent reading and like or current thinking, current imagination, and reflective imagination or reflective reading are like strictly opposed, right? So there's lots of like stories and genres that kind of want us to mobilize them both. Think of like detective stories, mysteries, right? You're supposed to be thinking like, okay, but like this person seems too obvious, right? So probably it's not them, but then again, maybe it is them, right? Or you're supposed to like eliminate suspects and sort of go through the process of detection yourself. And that's not to the story's detriment, right? That's how you're supposed to engage with a mystery. That makes it better and more fun. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does seem to happen a lot. One thing that I think we should notice and pay attention to in something like the Ant-Man case, right, is that when you noticed that like the tank was supposed to weigh a lot and all of a sudden it didn't, you didn't just sort of shrug and go, well, all right, whatever, right? The tank weighed a lot before and now it doesn't, or should have weighed a lot and now it doesn't. There's a contradiction, so whatever. You don't just accept it at face value. You struggle with it, right? You sit there after the movie. I mean, maybe you let it go for the sake of the movie, but after the movie, you sit there and you talk to your friends and you're like, how does that make sense? Like, what's going on? Did I miss something? Was there an extra rule somewhere that I didn't understand? Is there some like implicit rule that we weren't told that makes sense of this? What's going on? And that I think is a really like powerful, potent, important signal, right? That we don't just accept contradictions at face value when we notice them, right? If we don't notice them, we don't notice them. But when we do, we're like, hang on a minute, like what's going on? And that kicks us into the reflective mode. And in the reflective mode, I think we apply whatever epistemic standards we have, I guess. We bring to bear the information we have. And, I think that at least where our storytelling practices are concerned, at least where our storytelling behavior is concerned, the law of non-contradiction is a hard limit, right? I think it might be possible. I think you could imagine, yes, a world where like the history of storytelling went a little bit differently, right? And we were actually really like into contradictions. Like imagine like a Zen koan world, right? Where the purpose of telling stories is exactly the same purpose as like the Zen koan. Maybe that's a world where our practices are so different that we could say in that world, right, that in the stories there are actual contradictions. We are being asked to imagine them. Whether we succeed in imagining the contradiction in those worlds is another question. I'm not so sure the answer is yes, right? Like when you encounter a Zen koan, right, the whole point is just to get you thinking. And as long as you're thinking, as long as you're sort of trying to wrestle with that inherent contradiction, you're doing a good job. That's all you have to do. But nothing actually hinges on you actually imagining the contradiction, right? Like it's what expands your mind is doing the thinking part. And you can do the thinking part regardless of whether you can succeed in imagining it or not. I think that's true for other stories as well, right? Like the stories that contain contradictions, they're asking us to do something. If it's not just a mistake, right? So somebody like Grand Priest, he wants us to do something. He wants us to reflect on pair-consistent logic and whether it might be the logic of the world or the logic of fiction. And you can do that regardless of whether you can succeed in doing the contradictory imagining thing you're supposed to do.
Yeah, whereas the makers of Ant-Man, right? Like they're not
right.
trying to get us to think about, oh, what is this? What's happening here? Maybe the explanation originally given was mistaken, or it was dumbed down for the audience or for the character it was being told to, right? Maybe there's something else happening here. Maybe there's an implicit rule that we don't get that would sort of resolve this. But yeah, they're not asking us to do that work. It was just like a cool thing they wanted to do, right? For the sake of the movie.
Yeah, it's just a mistake.
Yeah, it is just sort of.
Or, I mean, maybe the person telling you the story is lying about it, right?
Yeah.
We embellish stories all the time. You're like, oh yeah, and then he pulled out like a 20-foot sword and holy crap, right? Maybe it's an instance of that. And then he pulled out a tank.
Yeah, right. And I think further, it's just there to give an explanation, right? Like the explanation itself doesn't matter because we don't care about the physics of it as viewers, right? Like, oh, this thing, all it needs to say is, oh, the thing shrinks, right? Like, why give this elaborate explanation? Well, he's a scientist and he's going to do that, right, to sort of show his mental superiority or something. But one point I think maybe to finish on is that the occurrent reflective distinction. It's not just true of reading. It's not just true of film. It's not true of stories, just of stories, right? It's true of, I think, aesthetic engagement more generally, of at least of things that unfold over time, right? Artworks that unfold over time. And so, you can imagine going to a concert of a band. You're sort of really into what they're doing. You're sort of absorbed occurrently into it. And then they start playing a song and you're like, wait, I recognize this. It's not one of theirs, right? It's like, what is this song? What is this song? Then you go, oh, it's a cover of such and such, right? And so, you're sort of meeting some resistance there from it's not a song of theirs, so it's not what you expected. And so it's like this really cool cover and you're like, oh, okay, that's what's going on, right? So the occurrent listening gives way to reflection when there's some form of resistance, similar to in the case of fiction as you've been describing it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's definitely not like these two tracks are definitely not two tracks that only apply to like story engagement, right? Like they clearly apply to all kinds of engagement that we have, especially aesthetic engagement. Um, like I was saying earlier, I'm a really big fan of melodic death metal, right? And what I think is really cool about melodic death metal is that what matters is the sound, right? Like proper aesthetic engagement with it is aesthetic engagement with the sound. It's not engagement necessarily with the lyrics. The lyrics don't really matter. They're vehicles for the growls. They're vehicles for whatever other vocalizations are going on. In fact, most of the time the lyrics aren't in English, right? They're in usually Swedish, sometimes Norwegian, Finnish, right? It's not languages that like Anglophone audiences readily understand, but it's hugely popular in the Anglophone world. When you do sometimes find like those lyrics in English, right? It's a bit of a misstep. It's a bit of a faux pas sometimes, right? Because the band is singing whatever they're singing, and then you catch the gist of like what the words are, and you're like, hang on a minute, like, okay, that doesn't make sense as a sentence in English, right? Or holy crap, that's a little bit weird, right? Or maybe it's a little bit scary, right? There's all these like extra levels that like come in once you start paying attention to the lyrical content, but you're not meant to pay attention to the lyrical content, right? You're not meant to engage with it reflectively that way. It works a lot better when you don't. Yeah.
Yeah, so you and Edward Hanslick sort of agree that it's better to, that this is his point about opera, right? That it's better to hear opera in a language that you don't know because you're paying attention not to the words, but to the unfolding tapestry of sounds that are hitting your ears, right?
Yeah, maybe. Although, I mean, I don't know what the purpose of opera is. I'm not sufficiently musically well versed to know. So maybe the purpose is to pay attention to the like vocalized lyrical story as well.
Yeah, I mean, Hanslick is just a hardcore formalist, so yeah, like the lyrics are something that you should set aside for the sake of properly musical appreciation, is his view. So on that note, that maybe we don't agree with Hanslick, or maybe we do to some extent, I think we should wrap this up. So thanks so much, Michelle. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.